the state of Indiana gave the first, for the first time, the new National Council of Architectural Registration Board examinations. This is now the two-part exam. If you graduate from an accredited school, you take only one of the two parts of the examination. On this first go-round, 7 College of Architecture and Planning graduates took the examination, and 7 College of Architecture and Planning alumni passed the examination. So that's good news for all of us. Professor Bonta, the Emens Distinguished Professor for this quarter for the college, spoke last quarter, and we tried to give you a good rundown on his background. I would say, and I'll try to make it short tonight, Juan, I would say that Professor Bonta was educated in Argentina. Even though he was born in Hungary, his family immigrated to Argentina, and he was educated there. He has taught in Argentina, and he has lectured many places in Argentina and South America, in Spain and other countries in Europe. He's done research work and taught in Europe. He has taught and lectured in America as well. He is now finishing a book that will be published in the fall, both in England and in Spain, in 2 different languages, and both at the same time. We're very happy to have a second Emens lecture from Professor Bonta, Juan Bonta.
Thank you very much. My Lord, once again, I have neither bread, nor wine, nor altar. But I shall raise myself above these symbols up to the pure majesty of reality. And I, your priest, will offer you upon the altar of the whole earth the labor and the suffering of the world. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard said these words while he was preaching in the steppes of Asia. And the fact of not having bread, not having wine, not having altar, in other words, not having a church, was no hamper for him conducting his ceremony and his communion with God. It seems to me that this passage is very illustrative as to show that religious sacrifice, religious experience can take place anywhere. And this is in a way a unique characteristic of religiosity. If you want to swim, you need a swimming pool. You cannot just open the faucet and swim. If you want to produce automobiles, you need a factory. If you want to teach children, you need to bring them to a school. If I want to give this lecture and you want to listen to it, we need this very hall. We need these walls in order to you to be able to hear me. I need the screen to show some slides. I need the microphone to be plugged into the audience, into you, and to be able for you to hear me. But if I want to have a religious experience, if I want to communicate with God, no microphone is needed. More than that, most of the activities we usually undertake need very specific environmental conditions. If I want to swim, the temperature of the room has to be within certain thresholds. If I want to read, I need certain type of lighting. If I want to lecture, we need a place where the background noise does not exceed certain limits. On the other hand, there are other activities for which no precise environmental specifications can be given. It doesn't make sense to ask which is the temperature to feel patriotism, which is the humidity of the air necessary to fall in love. And religious experience is one of these things for which no specific building type is needed, no specific environmental conditions must be prescribed. I'm not saying that we do not need churches. What I'm saying is that the form of those churches will not result from the pure analysis of the activities which the building is supposed to shelter. The creed of the functionalist movement of the early 20s and 30s, which at a certain moment imagined that hypothetically it was possible to design architecture by a sort of machine in which the input was the activity, and there the information was processed in a certain way, and the output was the project for the building. This idea that you can relate one-to-one activities and building types just does not work with churches. And I think that it is no coincidence that the modern movement was best known for building types such as housing, factories, educational buildings, railway stations, large exhibition halls, all of which, up to a certain point at least, could be faced with the ideology of the modern movement. The best of these buildings were much more than what the theories of the modern movement claimed them to be. The best of these buildings were not only machines to live in, not only machines to produce. The best of these buildings achieved high poetic quality. But the important fact is that the theory of the modern movement, and when I say modern movement today, I will always refer to the 20s and to the 30s up to the Second War. The theories disregarded this fact, and they concentrated purely on mechanical function. And when occasionally these modern architects faced the problem of something more than function, some meaning, some artistic value or some poetic value, they tried to limit these significant or meaningful contents to the type of art which at that moment was in vogue, abstract art, abstractionism. And it's no coincidence that the very basis of the abstract approach to art was the negation of all meaning, of all contents. Actually, the best architects of the modern movement built some outstanding churches, but it's amazing that whenever they did it, they had to, in a way, disregard, forget some of their own writings and some of their own ideologies. When Le Corbusier built Ronchamp, it was no doubt one of the masterpieces of 20th century religious architecture, but it was a shock to the generation of architects preceding ours to see that the high priest of functionalism was doing a building which could not possibly be understood in the terms of his pre-war theories. I think that religious architecture played an important role in the defeat of the creed of the modern movement, a defeat which some architects and perhaps some teachers are still reluctant to recognize. However, I think that the defeat of the creed of the modern movement today must be accepted as obvious for anyone who just looks around and watches the environment in which we live. I think we can no longer say that the people are not educated enough, they don't know what is good. We, a selected group of professionals committed to a fairly restricted and crippled view of architecture, we know, and we have to wait till the people agree to our highly sophisticated intellectual approaches. I think that this is essentially wrong, that time has come to review our theories, and it seems to me that we are in this time exactly in the starting point of a new theoretical approach to architecture, which will probably enrich the rather crippled view of the modern movement. I'm not saying that functionalism has nothing valid in it. It's obvious that where functionalism is needed, functionalism should be there. But what I'm saying is that in addition to the consideration of functional problems in defining the shape of a building and in defining its environmental conditions, other issues ought to be brought into the picture just as well. As you probably know, since a few years I am committed to try to illuminate from new points of view the theory of architecture. And it seems to me that semiotics, which is a general study of communication, of systems of communication, is highly relevant to our matter. And it seems to me that religious architecture, which was absolutely ill-suited to the classical approach of the modern movement, will probably be one of the areas in which the semiotic approach can produce some concrete results very shortly. I want to present to you, before going to the slides, a series of basic concepts which I think relevant to the issue. The first of them will be the distinction between drama and ritual. And rather than defining them, I would prefer to give a few examples. When a man falls in love with a woman, that, in my terms, is drama. He will ask her whether she wants to accept him, to love him, and the answer can be yes or can be no. Anything can happen. The situation is an open, indeterminate situation. When this same couple eventually gets married and they have a ceremony, either religious or civil, and they go to see a priest or they go to see a judge, someone, the priest or the judge or perhaps the groom, will ask the very same question: do you love me? Do you want to be my wife? And this time the answer will be predetermined. This is not a dramatic situation, this is a ritual situation. This couple is reenacting in a formalized way, in a ceremony, something which has already happened before in actual life. When Jesus had his Last Supper with the disciples, that was drama. The situation was open-ended, nobody knew what was going to happen. When the Last Supper is reenacted thousands of times every day in each church, with the sacrifice of Holy Communion, that is ritual. It's the same situation reenacted, but this time congelated, fixed, predetermined. When in the 2nd century before Christ, the Maccabeans defeated the Syrians and they reestablished the Jewish kingdom in Jerusalem, there was no oil to light the candles in the temple but for one day. And yet, miraculously, the candles burned for 8 days, each day with more light than in the previous one. And this was drama. When each year in the Jewish festivity of Hanukkah, a 9-candle chandelier is lit, and one more candle is lit each day, this is reenacting the miracle, and this is not drama, this is ritual. Religious architecture is mainly concerned with the ritual aspect of religion, not with the dramatic aspect of religion. And this, of course, makes the problem of religious architecture so much easier, so much more predictable. The second point I want to bring into our analysis is that there are, it seems to me, 2 ways of approaching architecture, 2 basic conceptions about what architecture is all about. One of them is to conceive architecture as an enclosure of space, and the other one is to think of it as a marker of space. When you think of architecture as an enclosure, you are thinking in an envelope, in a piece of space which is wrapped in some material in order to adapt it to certain conditions we want to get inside. Architecture has been described as an environmental filter. As we don't have outside in nature the type of space we need for our activities, we have to put a filter between ourselves and the outside world, and this is what architecture is all about. It's a way to enclose space, to filter it, to adapt it. This is one approach to architecture. The approach I'm going to suggest as an alternative is architecture as a space marker, as a qualifier of space, as a way to make space distinguishable, to make one piece of space different from another piece of space. From the point of view of its marking function, if architecture encloses, it encloses not so much or not only to adapt, it encloses to separate, to have boundaries, to distinguish this and that, inside from outside, to substitute the natural, continuous, homogeneous space by an artificial, discontinuous, heterogeneous space. You may notice that according to how do we approach architecture, the history of architecture changes radically. There are really two histories of architecture. One, architecture as enclosure, the other one as marker. If we think only of built architecture, and we think that architecture is essentially a matter of enclosing space, of adapting space, I would say that architecture started with huts, with tanned, stretched skins of animals. And this would take us back thousands of years. On the other hand, if we think that architecture is essentially a business of marking space, then architecture would begin with the first monolith. And this would take us back 10 times more. It would take us back not to thousands of years, but to tens of thousands of years. We can also think of architecture not as built architecture, but as natural architecture, and the same relationship of 1 to 10 would still hold. If architecture is enclosed space, then the first natural enclosed space were the caves. And this takes us back tens of thousands of years. But if architecture is a matter of marking space, then the first examples of architecture in history were the trees, the stones, the accidents which man found in his physical environment and which helped him to identify the identity of territory. The very basic ideas of here and there, near and far, left and right are only possible if we understand them in relation to certain space markers, which to me were the very beginning of architecture. It seems to me that architecture as a marker offers us a much richer approach and a much more comprehensive approach than the rather limited approach, architecture as enclosure. And certainly a semiotic view of architecture in the sense of a significant instrument must take notice of the fact that architecture not only adapts, but architecture also qualifies, also marks the space. And this was overlooked by the functionalist theory. We said before that religious architecture was concerned with ritual, not with drama. If this is so, the church can either be an enclosure of ritual or it can be a marker of ritual. A church can be a filter which we put between the external environment and the place where the ritual is going to take place, or alternatively, the church could be a ritual object itself. It could be a marker which participates in the ritual. If architecture is enclosure and if religion is ritual, then the functionalist approach becomes possible again. It becomes possible to ask how much space do we need to kneel down. It is possible to ask which is the best lighting conditions in order to be able to see, say, the sacraments. It is possible to ask which are the acoustic conditions we need in order to listen to the priest.
Okay. Fine. Okay.
If we see architecture as a marker, then in addition to these problems, there is one more to be considered, and this is the building is rather than an adapter of space, It is a way of marking that space, of making it special, or separating that space from the other spaces within which we live. And this is really, seems to me, the very basic idea of what a church is all about. The Roman Catholic rite of consecration of a church shows this very clearly. The Genesis has a passage which is quoted in the consecration rites, referring to Jacob, who had a dream showing a ladder on which angels went up and down, symbolizing the communication of man with God. Jacob set up a stone in the place where he saw the ladder, and that stone was called the gate to heaven. And the stone is not an adapter, it's not an instrument to go up and down. The stone is a marker, is a way to say this is the place, and the church has to be built around the altar stone, which is a marker of a point and not an instrument in the functionalist sense. Needless to say that when we are thinking on complex technological societies as ours, churches has to be both markers and enclosures, both markers and adapters. The church will have to modify the environment. We will have to use the church as a filter between the external space and the internal space. But we also have to remember that the building has to be a marker. And this means that we have to adapt our space not in ordinary ways, but in special ways. And the next problem which we have to face is how can we use a building to mark a space as being special. And this takes me to the third issue I want to present to you. The first was the distinction between drama and ritual. The second, the distinction between enclosure and marker. And the third one, perhaps somewhat more difficult to put through, is a subtle distinction between what something is and what it means. To be and to mean are two verbs which are not to be considered equivalent. And I want to draw your attention to the difference between being a special place and meaning a place to be special. And I would like to start with giving a simpler example than a religious space. Let me give an example as simple as this. A space can be clean or it can mean cleanliness. Think in an operation theater in a hospital. It is probably absolutely aseptic, so it's no doubt that that space is absolutely clean. But it not also is clean, it also expresses, using a certain language, a certain series of signals, that the space is clean. Probably the color will be white or very near white. The type of materials which will be used will be specifically linked and associated for everybody to the idea of surgical cleanliness. On the other hand, we could, if we wanted, to make this lecture hall absolutely aseptic. It would be technically very easy to bring in the necessary equipment and to kill all the germs existing here. And this room would be clean, but it would not mean asepsy. Why not? Because the type of materials we have, the type of colors, the type of furniture are not associated within our architectural language to that particular idea of cleanliness. So on one hand we have things which are, as a matter of fact, are clean or dirty. And on the other hand we have things which express or do not express certain ideas by using conventional language. The idea of language becomes essential whenever we want to consider meaning. A place can mean cleanliness and be dirty. Why not? I can use language to say things which are not truth. Language is not concerned with matters of fact. Language is concerned with statements which can either be truthful or untruthful. A characteristic of language is that language is articulated. And articulation of language is the very clue to its success. We can communicate with a language like English, which has only some 10,000 words, of which I probably don't know more than 1,000. And we can produce with this limited repertory of words a tremendously large number of different sentences. There are no limits to the different kind of things you can say by using just a restricted vocabulary of words. And this is possible thanks to the fact that words can be used in more than one context. I can use the same word in different sentences, and the word will always mean the same thing, and yet it can be adapted to a different context I want to express. Architectural language is in very many ways similar to human language. And what semiotics is all about is to perceive and to understand architectural language not as a matter of things which are said as a matter of fact, but as a language which is conventional and by which we can express things which can either be facts or can be disproved. So when we come back now to a church which has to be a special place, we have to distinguish between places which are special really as a matter of fact from spaces which are said to be special, which are presented as being special. And these two things are not necessarily equivalent. In long-established architectural languages, churches were recognized by a series of features such as having bell towers, pitched roof, rose windows, and all these elements having certain relationships among themselves. Ruskin wrote in the 19th century a famous passage describing what is a church. What should a church look like? And the passage shows that his view of a church is what a church ought to look and not what a church ought to be. The problem was not a functional problem. The problem for Ruskin was not to say how should a church be built in order to be functionally correct. The problem for him was how should a church be built in order to be recognized as a church, in order to mean church. So in the 19th century there was a well-established architectural language. The modern movement started as a revolt against all established architectural languages, against all existing systems of conventions. The task was not to say for them, using a conventional language, that this place was special. For them, the place which was going to be the church had to be actually special. And how can one make a place actually special? One can make it by using special materials or special technologies, or by using special shapes or special colors or special effects of light. But in doing this, the modern movement was trapped in a dead end, was caught in a paradox. And this paradox is inevitable whenever there is a revolt against language and against convention. And why was it a dead end? For two reasons. First, because the new materials and technologies were soon to be used for other purposes than religious architecture. And in so doing, they will cease to be special, they will cease to be new. And second, the first modern churches, which started as being something unique, something special, very soon generated a new typology. Similar churches would appear in other parts of the world as the modern movement spread. The new configurations would be recognized as being a church, not because of their intrinsic qualities of churchship, if I may invent this word, but because they have already been seen in other places. They ceased to be special, they began to mean special. And this is where the paradox comes. Real speciality requires uniqueness. Meaning speciality requires convention, repetition. In trying to get rid of language, the modern movement created a new language. And the same happened really in very many other fields of culture. The hippie movement started as an attempt to be different, as an attempt to overcome conventions, as an attempt to be free. But it ended up by creating a new set of conventions, a new particular way of tying up human freedom. As the same thing happened very many times before, and it seems to me that we are condemned to see it happening over and over again. What the hippies did in the 60s was done in the 40s by the existentialists, and in the 20s by the Dadaists. I have one more final question to put forward, and this is, what is, if anything, what is intrinsically religious? Is there any area of human life which is intrinsically more connected to religion than other areas? If there is, it would be good for the artist and for the architect to know it. Is religion particularly connected to suffering? Is it connected to happiness? Is it connected to childhood or to elderliness? To life or to death? To loneliness? To community? Is it connected to individual identity? Or is it connected to the universal being of mankind? It is hard to say. And there is really here one more final difficulty. And let me present an analogy in another field, which is music. Last time I spoke to you, I presented a Baroque composition, the Stabat Mater by Vivaldi. You may remember it. It was a very religious composition describing Maria in front of Jesus Christ hanging on the cross. Both the text and the music expressed an infinite sorrow and pain. So the religiosity can be linked, very often is linked to suffering. Now, on the other side of the same record, you would find Vivaldi's Gloria, which is just the opposite. The Gloria is happiness, rejoice, exaltation. So, if also the Gloria is religious, one would conclude that religious experience encompasses everything in the life. No segment of human life is foreign to religiosity. But I have a son who is 6 and who does not think so. He has his own idea about what religious music is, and it seems to me that his ideas are quite consistent. For him, both the Stabat Mater and the Gloria are religious music. Whenever he hears one or the other, he says, that's church music. He seems to classify them together, and I'm not sure if we are aware of any difference between them. And then on the other hand, he identifies music which for him is not religious. Now, the thing is particularly tricky because on one hand, children of 6 assume that there are two areas of life, church and not church, religious and not religious. On the other hand, the church itself as an institution tries to encompass the totality of human life within the area it is concerned with. And actually this is expressed even by music. You probably know that in the latest times very many attempts have been made to compose liturgical music, church music, by using folkloric themes. And there are plenty of examples. We have an Argentinian folkloric mass. I know of a Congolese folkloric mass, and I'm sure that American folkloric music has also been used for religious purposes. It seems to me that we are faced with a never-ending game. On one hand, there is an attempt to make everything transparent religion pervading the totality of our life. On the other hand, there seems to be some sort of internal equilibrium, some sort of balance within human society which tends to put limits. This is religious and this is not. The issue is really extremely complex, and it's not much more what I can say about it, except that it is a kind of pendular game, that we are facing a permanent dynamic relationship of things which are seen as non-religious, and then they can be approached from a point of view of religiosity, but then somewhere else in some other area of culture, something else will happen which will claim to be non-religious. So this fact of the limits between what is religious and what is not is one of the most complex problems we have to face if we want to get involved with designing for the church. Having said this, I would like now to illustrate some of these points with a few slides. I'm starting with a distinction between what is drama and what is ritual. This is drama. This is an open situation. We cannot know where will it end, whereas this situation is the equivalent ritual in which the same situation is reenacted again. This boy selling things in the middle of the street is in a dramatic situation. He is open to anything. He can face any type of situation which the bypassers will suggest to him. Selling situation in an organized shop as this one is ritual. And I'm using now drama and ritual not in a religious context to show that the same ideas can be applied also in other areas. There are activities which are free and there are activities which are ritualized. And a good deal of our architectural concern is related to ritualized activities. This old man with his guitar is in a situation which I would describe as dramatic and open. The conductor of a orchestra in a concert is, on the other hand, in a situation which is ritual and predetermined. This holy man in India is in a dramatic situation. He's having a religious experience. He needs to participate in no well-defined space. He is living something absolutely separated from the external world. This woman having a bath in the sacred waters of the Ganges on the other side is having also a religious experience, but this is a ritualized experience which has to take place in a certain place and in certain ways, and probably also in certain times of the day. Again, here we have another holy man in a dramatic religious experience, and on the other hand, a Shintoist monk in a ritualized religious experience. You can see how important in this case is to have a clear definition of space. The whole bodily position would be senseless and meaningless would it not be in front of a particular point in space, the altar, where the center of the religious experience is supposed to take place. The circle of stones of Stonehenge, one of the most remote architectural monuments in Europe, again is religious architecture, but it's ritual religious architecture. And the main point here is to encompass a certain area of space by putting limits which are to function not as adapters of space, but as markers of space. The idea is to identify a certain space, to separate it from the rest. The very same idea is expressed in contemporary terms in Brazilia's cathedral. You can see that there is no adaptation of space. Actually, the real functional space occurs underneath this level. All what we can see here, which apparently is a building, is nothing but an equivalent to the stones of Stonehenge. And the purpose is just to enclose symbolically the space, to limit it. The relationship between architecture and space is particularly complex, and this example is in a way unique in the 20th century. This is a chapel at Dachau, as a place where the concentration camp was. It's a place which marks a particularly dramatic place in contemporary history. And I think that this is among the very few spaces in modern architecture in which the building was built to identify a place which was important before the building came. However, this is a typical situation in most of architectural history in the past. The large churches and basilicas were built in places which are supposed to be sacred before the actual building was built. The Basilica of St. Peter in Rome is built in the place where it is the Peter's martyrdom is supposed to have taken place. This situation is unique in the 20th century because not very many places remain which are linked to the historical religion. So we very seldom have a building which shows a place which was important before the building was built. Usually it is the other way about. It is the building, the one which has to turn important a place which in itself was amorphous. Another rather unique example of contemporary religious architecture is to be found in Paris, just behind the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Notre Dame, perhaps I should say. It's a monument which is commemorating all the people who have been deported in Europe during the Second War. And their number is calculated in 200,000 people. Now, if you see in the middle of the dark area, and I would welcome to have a lighter if someone would be kind enough to look for one. If you can see in the middle of the dark area a light, that very light is the same we can see now here, and you see that it appears limited by two walls with lights, and it's estimated that on each of these walls there are 100,000 lights. So on the whole, there is one little light for each person who has been deported in Europe during the war. And I present this as a very rare and very unusual example of symbolism, because it's a very simple symbolism in which each light means one human being. The place in which this is allocated is also in a way, I would say in a rather crude way, symbolic. You can see here this very narrow stairway by which you can come down or you must climb up afterwards. And there is a relation between the pain and the sorrow you must feel because of the thing which this monument describes, and the spatial sensation you have in coming up or down to that particularly narrow entrance. But most cases of religious architecture are not as peculiar as the chapel at Dachau or as this memorial. So let's face straightforwardly the usual situation in which a community has to build a church. And I selected to start our study with two cathedrals which were built in the same city, Liverpool. One, the Anglican Cathedral, the one you are seeing. The next, we will see later, the Roman Catholic Cathedral. Both of them were built over an extended period of time during the 20th century, and both of them selected absolutely opposed approaches to what type of architecture to use. The Anglicans asked Sir Gilbert Scott to design a classical Gothic building, and here it is. All its features are rigorously historical. All the details are taken from the history of Gothic architecture in Europe, and this was looked down very much by all the people who were in favor of modern architecture. However, the space has a certain quality, a certain grandiosity, which it seems to me that it would be foolish to recognize just in order to reject it because it was not modern. True, it is not modern. However, if we are to be sensitive to architecture, we have to accept that this building is an extraordinary building, that it puts forward very delicate and very intricate games using the Gothic vocabulary, but using it in a way which has no equal in any of the really historical cathedrals. On the other side, here we have the cathedral, the Roman Catholic cathedral, designed by Frederick Gibbert and completed more or less at the same time in the middle 60s. What a difference in language. Forms are completely modern, and yet they are symbolic as well, but in a different way. There is an obvious symbolism in the higher part of the tower, representing the crown of spines, thorns, I think you call them in English, the crown which Jesus had the last day. But it seems to me that this very direct analogy is not really very important. Much more important than that, to me, is the fact that this is such a strong statement in order to define a place, to identify a place. This tower is, more than anything else, a way of showing where the center of the building is, where the most sacred part of the building is, of identifying, of qualifying the building as such. I think that from the point of view of symbolism, the bell tower is particularly worth considering. You can see that it attempts to be a very abstract composition in which no clear reference to any well-established bell tower type is made. More than that, this wall is carved in a way which seems to be completely abstract, and yet it would take some time to you to discover that in the middle of this, and I would be glad to show it if I had a pointer, there are some bells worked into the composition. But the bells are expected not to be recognized as such. The whole thing is supposed to be read as a completely abstract composition. And again, the way in which art is used. Art is always present, but is present in the most unexpected places, and by this fact of putting the art not in the conventional place where one would expect it, but by surprising us, by putting it in front of us just when we are going to enter the door, in this way art becomes tremendously powerful, but yet somewhat disconcerting. In the interior, we have the same thing. We have the most important feature, which is the tower, which is covered with stained glass, which filters the light, and which acts more than anything else as an identifier and a qualifier of the space. Now, how modern is this approach really? In spite of the modern materials and of the modern detailing, isn't there a certain similarity between this type of statement and the one of the very apparently opposite attitude of the Gothic cathedral? Isn't in this case a tower used just exactly in the same way? Isn't in the former case the attempt to show this continuity from down up to the very top? Isn't the same thing as what we have here, a continuity going from the bottom to the top? And isn't this a different use of the same basic architectural term? I think that it is. And if we come now to the bell tower, which apparently is a form which is not carrying any meaning, which is completely abstract, as soon as a modern movement spreads over the world, we can find plenty of examples. One of them in the United States this building by Breuer, in which the form or the shape of the bell tower is different, and yet the relationship between bell tower and building are the same. And what I'm showing with this example is that architectural language has a tendency to get established over and over again. We can make a form which the first time we see it is meaningless, and slowly we get used to it and the form becomes charged with meaning, and other forms appear in other places of the world repeating the very same basic term. And the same architect who did the Roman Catholic Cathedral at Liverpool, Frederick Gibbert, he himself imitated himself in this smaller church near Manchester, which, although different in size and different in details, is another way of using the same term. And by now we can show a large amount of buildings, all of them being variations of this very same basic idea of having a centralized space below, some sort of a pyramidal connection between the lower part and then the tower rising above. This church is by Perret in France, in Le Havre. Again, different materials, different shapes, but the same vocabulary which becomes established. Different materials, and the remarkable thing in this case is that the church is built with materials which were assumed to be unsuited to religious architecture. This is prefabricated slabs of concrete. But the religious character comes because of the use of the windows and of the light, and the very same effect of a tower on which the light comes in. Now, we can recognize here the beginning of a vocabulary, and this means that we don't have necessarily to use all of these elements combined as they are. We will see that we can get rid of the tower and yet have the very same statement in a church which has everything what the other churches had except the tower, which is replaced by a steeple. And this is not far from where we are. This is in Columbus, Indiana. The internal part of it has a different type of lighting, so we don't need the light coming in through the tower, but yet it is the same architectural element, a pyramidal space, which is associated with the idea of togetherness. And we can travel now to the other hemisphere, to the south hemisphere, and in the surroundings of Buenos Aires, this church of Our Lady of Fatima, in a different material, again put the same word, togetherness, with the same type of space. Of course, just as in language, these words can be used in different ways and in different contexts. In this case, in addition to the shape, what is important are the materials, which are the classical colonial materials of the Spanish colonies of America. Brick painted white. Instead of glass, this is replaced by marble, which was used in the colony as a substitute for glass. In extremely dramatic lighting, the light comes this way so that it will get diffused in touching the white walls. Externally, the same materials, modern detailing, and yet the presence of some elements of the Argentine tradition. This shape, which expresses externally the internal space, is to be found very frequently in colonial architecture. Here you have it. And the idea of having a closed courtyard is also very Spanish, and it happens in a way as well in Our Lady of Fatima. The same shapes, the same truncated pyramids, and a series of alleys with roofs creating a sort of patio in modern terms. We were talking about bricks, and let's see now how can brick be used in a completely different way for religious purposes. This is a church in Atlántida, Uruguay, by Eladio Dieste, and it's a quite remarkable church because Dieste is a creator of a particular system which he calls reinforced brick, by which he uses bricks in a way which I don't think it has been used before in other places. In between the layers of bricks, he will put strings of iron, and by doing this, he will give to the material the possibility of working both to compression and to traction. I would very briefly give some technical information about this building. I will try to make it brief. This whole structure can be conceived as a rigid frame, taking away this area here, which is just a wall. But this is a rigid frame which has all the classic properties of rigid frame. This wall here is a straight line and therefore has no inertia. As we climb up, you see that it begins to become a sinusoid, and therefore the inertia of the wall increases. And this is rigidly connected, in a momentum connection with the roof, which in itself is ondulated. And the roof, because it faces the wall not in a straight line which would permit rotation, but with these curves, becomes rigidly linked to it, and the whole structure behaves, as I said, as a rigid frame. One would think that this rather unusual use of technology would in itself be a religious plus, that the fact that the church is built in a way in which brick was never used before adds to its value. However, in this case, the story is funny because it's just the opposite way around. The church had no money to hire an architect, and Eladio Dieste, who designed it, and who is not an architect by training but an engineer, was a parishioner, and he was asked to do the church because there was nobody better available to do it. And he has been using this type of structures for industrial buildings, for warehouses, and for factories. And everybody, starting with himself, thought that this technology was absolutely unsuited for a religious building. So what did he do? First, he used some very simple ways of symbolism. For instance, he put the baptistry down in order to symbolize the fact that the one who is accepted in the church has to be submerged and then to come up to the surface again, which is an idea linked to the primitive rite of baptism. And the second thing he did was try to make as carefully handcrafted a building as possible. Look at this thing here, which is a chapel for Our Lady, and which in more detail you can see it here. You can see that each brick, by the way, Uruguay has a wonderful, really good quality brick. Each brick has been tailored one by one in order to fit to this truncated cone, and here you have a marble. Here we are in the process of cutting each brick in order to shape it exactly as it should be. And by using brick in this very careful way, what he tried was to achieve a quality which he thought brick in itself would not have. This wall here is as round as marble. You can put your hand there and there will be no straight line. And this again is achieved by cutting bricks one by one. Marble to have the same type of lighting inside as we saw in the other building. Here we have the inside. You can also see these little windows which remind very much of Ronchamp. And in my view, the real religiosity of this place depends not on the careful handcraft, but on the very plastic potentialities of the structure itself, and on the fact that being a rational structure is also tremendously plastic. You can see that at different types of the day, the shadows will achieve different length. So actually you will have here, as the sun moves, a permanently ongoing spectacle. At the left, the tower, which is in itself a wonderful piece of engineering, again nothing but brick, and inside these cantilevering stairs, which are nothing but 2 layers of brick with these little pieces of iron in between. This is how the building looked before it was finished. The door was not yet there. You can see the light coming in through the choir, the windows, looking to the other side. A very special effect of lighting which comes from below. So this is a horizontal window where the light comes from down up, and it gets reflected in a wall of masonry of bricks, in which each brick has one of the corners coming out. And this shape here is nothing but the straightforward result of lighting on the top of it, which is done with the most ordinary material you can imagine, simply the same thing used to put plants, cutting the base of it. A few more examples, perhaps one more to be seen with some detail. A church in the outskirts of Stockholm. It doesn't impress like a church. It impresses as a fine building, and again what we see is a very, very careful construction and detailing of the wall. But on the whole, the character is remarkably as a house. Plenty of openings. Each opening seems to fall exactly where it is needed, and one is not really impressed by anything which would normally be associated to a church architecture. Yet the entrance is quite strong, is accentuated with these structures which, if anything, they would have a sort of a Japanese quality. Water, which means reflection of the light, and it also means sound of water falling down. One wondering what is the whole thing about, it seems to convey perfectly well this idea of a special building for special purposes. However, there are also examples of churches which do not convey this idea of speciality, and plenty of them are to be found in Scandinavia. This is a Swedish example of a church which looks very much like a house. And coming back to the United States, Miss van der Rohe's chapel at IIT, which again, most people would agree that it does not look like a chapel. However, it seems to me that we are faced here with a different situation. I don't think that Miss van der Rohe was trying to make the building look secular. I think it's the other way about. He was so convinced that his materials and his detailing were just perfect that in making the chapel just the same as the other buildings of the campus, he was expressing, or he was trying to express, that the architectural vocabulary he was using was as near perfection as is humanly possible. Whether we agree with this or not is another matter.
That's it.
I think we have to change the magazine.
Oh, wait a second. I think it's changing. Come on, no.
One cannot mention IIT's chapel without comparing it with MIT's chapel by Saarinen, which is probably just the opposite extreme in the axis. Here we have a space which is absolutely unique. Most people who would feel uncomfortable in Miss van der Rohe's would say that this is an appropriate place for meditation. Now, the fact that it is unique is important. I wonder how would we feel if this particular form would become universal. How would we feel if all our churches had such type of a composition of little moving elements, reflecting elements behind the altar. It seems to me that it would be simply unbearable if all churches had this, and here we are in an extraordinary situation in which the uniqueness is not an expressed uniqueness but an actual uniqueness, and for the form to be effective it has to remain unique. As soon as we imitate it, we would destroy its value. On the other hand, a different situation we will find it if we go to Brazil, Oscar Niemeyer's church at Pampula, near Belo Horizonte. This is a church which was built in the early 40s and which took some 20 years of fight with the Catholic hierarchy to be accepted as a church, to be consecrated.
Okay.
And it seems to me that there is very much to be learned about this situation. Today, in the 1970s, I don't think that anybody of us would feel that this church does not express religious feelings. But, as I say, 20 years had to pass between the moment in which it was conceived and today. And when it was built for the people, for the community for whom it was built, it was not effective. This was seen as a kind of modern monstrosity. It was supposed to be essentially alien to religious feeling. Again, one more opposite situation, and this is the last architectural example, is a church in Holland, in which we find a kind of caricature of modern forms composed in a way which is classical. The bell tower, rather two bell towers in the facade, and the relation between bell tower and the building are strictly based on classical precedents. Yet the classical elements are replaced by supposedly modern ones. I don't know if it's clear enough the contrast between this church near Amsterdam and the one in Brazil. In this case, we have an architect who tried to remain faithful to the classic ecclesiastical architectural language, and he modernized only the details. And we have a building which I think we cannot but reject. On the other hand, we have an architect like Niemeyer who did not try to use the classical existing language. He invented a new language, but his building took 20 years to be accepted. It seems to me that this shows the dilemma in which architects are caught today, both in religious architecture and in other types of architecture. It seems to me that we have a new language which has not yet been completely established, and we have an old language which cannot be used any longer. How will we get rid of this special situation? How much time will we have to wait till we get again into an integrated cultural situation in which an architectural language exists and is spoken by all sectors of the community? How much will it take? I do not know. What I do know is that in working towards that aim, a few considerations will necessarily have to be taken into account. One of them is that we are working for real people as people are. We are not inventing an architecture for architectural students. Our architecture has to be perceived and understood by the real people who are outside there. This may mean that we will have to cease to be so in-reading, just listening to each other, and we have to go outside to the real world to see how do real people behave, how do they live, how do they feel, what are the things they believe in. It probably also means that we will have to consider not only the single individual, but society as such. And this put forward tremendously complicated problems of how to deal with a multi-personal society. I don't know how to do it. What I do know is that society in this time and in any times, if it is going to be a human society, will have to respect certain very basic phenomena which are important for mankind. Nature is one of them. And nature has certain basic symbols, such as sun and shadow, water and the sea. And it seems to me that no matter which will be the development of architectural language, some basic elements of human personality and of the world in which we live are going to be present in the language, whatever that language will be. Thank you very much.